also we have students here from the high school, from Ermysted and from Giggleswick, so welcome. The process for today is that we have 4 candidates who very kindly joined us, which is great, and we will be giving them 5 minutes each to speak to you, and then you will be the ones in control and asking questions. So I have to say to you, we have no fire alarms planned, so if there is a fire alarm, there are exits on either side. Please go outside and follow a number of staff to the mustering point. It's really great that you're all here today, and many of you I know will be first-time voters. I think what's really, really interesting about this election is that my prediction is it will be an election that will be spoken about for many, many years to come, given where we are as a country and also globally some of the many things that are happening to us. So make sure that you get this chance to ask all the questions that you really want to ask and get answers to. So behind me, it gives me great pleasure to welcome John Dawson, who is chairman of the Conservative Party locally. John is standing in for Julian Smith MP. Julian has held the Skipton and Ripon seat since 2010. Julian is still Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and unfortunately has had to return to Northern Ireland today, and so John is standing in on his behalf. We've got Andy Brown from the Green Party. In 2016, Andy became the first Green Party District Councillor in Craven at the last general election. He's a retired FE lecturer and manager and was director of Hillsborough College in Sheffield. We've also got Brian McDaid. Brian has lived in Craven for over 13 years. He's a senior trade union officer at Skipton Building Society and Computershare. And finally, Andrew Murday for the Liberal Democrat Party. Andrew is a cardiac surgeon by profession and now runs a small holding near Glasshouses in Nidderdale. He was involved in the Labour Party politics for many years and joined the Lib Dems in 2017. So, some of the students at the front of Ermysted have picked the order in which the candidates will speak. So the candidates now have 5 minutes, starting with Brian to address you.
Okay, well thank you everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Come on, a bit more enthusiasm there. Okay, so this is my first campaign, and the question is, lots of people have asked me, why are you standing? And why are you standing in an area that is seen as a Conservative stronghold? There's no point, standing, you're not going to win. For me, that's not a good reason. I think no politician, no candidate, no party should feel comfortable in a seat. And second reason I'm standing here is we need change. I'm fed up of seeing the vulnerable in our society, the young, the old, the disabled, continuously having their support cut away from them and all their opportunities diminish. As was said, I've lived in this constituency for over 13 years. I've watched my family grow up here, and I'm not going to embarrass my stepdaughter sitting in the back there. I won't say who you are. And as I said, I've watched my family grow up here. But I've also seen what austerity, and you've all heard the word austerity, has done in the last decade across this community and across society in the UK. My son has had many health challenges over the years. When he was born premature, so he spent a lot of time in intensive care. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed with autism, and at the age of 6, he was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. After chemotherapy and radiotherapy, he came through it and he was cured. But during that time, it really opened my eyes on how crucial and vital our National Health Service is, and how wonderful and dedicated the people that work in there, all the nurses, the surgeons, the doctors, all the charity workers that helped out, the cleaners, catering staff that really, really helped me, my families and many other families in a similar situation. So for me to see a National Health Service at risk of being privatised and being put on a table for any trade deal in a negotiation for Brexit is shocking. I do not want to see that happen. I don't think our NHS should be for sale, and I won't let it happen if it does. So that's one reason, but also we've got a society where we have food banks, and we've got a food bank in Skipton, we've got one in Settle, we've got one in Ripon. So across the constituency we have food banks. We're a society that's the 5th richest economy in the world. We should not have food banks. When food banks were introduced in 2010, 40,000 people relied on food banks. Last year that figure was sitting at 1.6 million. 1.6 million people relying on handouts in this society. No family should be relying on handouts. There's this thing, I visited the food banks recently, and they have this thing called a cold box that they give out to people. Have any of you heard what a cold box is? Don't think many people have. What a cold box is, they give it out to families who can't afford heating. So, and they're quite popular, these cold boxes. So it's cold food because they haven't got the facilities to heat up their own food. Again, that's a shocking statistic. We should not have that in our society. Child poverty, and you've heard that in the news recently. We have child poverty that is at an alarming growing rate across the UK. In Skipton and Ripon, you think it's a very affluent area. You know, we shouldn't have child poverty here. We've got 18% of children living in poverty. 18%. For me, it's just shocking that we have a society where child poverty is growing and no one seems to be talking about it. You look at the Conservatives and you look at Boris Johnson, all they're focused on is getting Brexit done, get Brexit done. To me, okay, it's a very important issue, but there's so many other things happening in our society that we really need to address as well. Homelessness, again, something we don't really see in the streets of Skipton and Ripon, but across the UK, that's becoming an epidemic. For yourself, young people, when you leave home eventually, hopefully you will soon too, no, I'm joking, Julia, is 20% of 18 to 25-year-olds are sofa surfing. So sofa surfing means that you're going around houses because you've got no accommodation of your own because you can't afford housing. A lot of you will be planning to go to university, so it's a great opportunity, but many people won't be able to because you might not be able to afford it. Because at the moment, if you went through university, had to get a student loan, there's no maintenance grants, an old thing that we used to get when we went to university, you'd end up coming out with an average of £57,000 of debt. How can you start your life? How can you afford a house? How can you feel comfortable when already that first step out there into the world, you have that amount of debt? So for a Labour Party, we'll scrap tuition fees and we'll introduce the maintenance grant. So maintenance grant is something I had. It just helps you live day to day and it makes you feel comfortable so you can focus on the important thing, and that is educating yourself. So there are so many issues out there that, for me, need to be talked about, for people to open their eyes at as well. Other thing is we've got such a huge division in society caused by Brexit and the effect of Trump over in the USA. My wife is from Poland and she moved over here about 15 years ago, and there's a big Polish community sitting in Skipton, but a lot of them have left over the last year because they don't feel welcome because of the nature of Brexit and all this talk about immigration. For me, again, that is a shocking way to have our society where people don't feel welcome. Look at our history as a country, as a nation. We've always embraced people coming here and working here and providing to society. So again, for me, to people feel left out, feel they're not wanted in this place is shocking. So I could go on and on about different things, but another real issue for me is I'm a parent governor for 2 schools in Skipton. Brooklands Special Needs School, where my son goes to, and also the Craven Pupil Referral Service. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of that second one. It's a place on Keighley Road that looks after students who are struggling in mainstream school, either in grammar school, in academy, wherever, who are either having behavioural issues or mental health issues. The latter, mental health, is an issue that is growing at an alarming rate, not just in young people but in adults as well. But what's happening is they're threatening to close down that referral centre, and also there's no contingency plan on what to do with those 60 students that sit there. They've got a year before they're actually either put back into mainstream schools, put back into the community, and for them there's no support. Again, this is another measure of austerity where this Conservative government has cut away at all the support we have for mental health, for addiction. So,
if I can stop.
Sorry, am I going on?
Yeah, you just going up to over your 5
Right,
minutes.
just last point. On the 12th of December, for those that can vote, you have a real choice. You've got the choice of sticking for what we have, or worse, another 5 years of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister scares me, or you can vote for change. Vote for Labour and you will vote for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for the introduction, and thanks, Brian. My name's Andrew Murday. I'm a doctor by profession. I worked most of my life in cardiac surgery and then the last few years in palliative medicine. I guess what one has to decide when you go to the ballot box is on what basis do you vote for the candidate of your choice. And it seems to me you vote for the person, you vote for their philosophy, and you vote for their politics. Now, each of us is honourable. I know because we've met several times over the last few weeks. As you can imagine, we're almost a touring circus troupe now, and we've all well rehearsed our speeches and our questions and our answers. And we're all good friends, and that might be a surprise to you. Most people in politics are there for a purpose, and they are there to make life for everybody better. We just have different ways of trying to get to that point. And of course, from a philosophical point of view, there is quite a marked difference between the Greens, Labour, Conservative, and myself and the Liberal Democrats. So let me just outline what I think is the underlying political philosophy of the Liberal Democrats. It's about creating a society that's free within the rule of law. It's about creating a society where everybody has an opportunity to achieve their full potential. It's about having a society that's tolerant of all sorts of different ways of thinking, of ways of acting, of ways of living your life. And it's a society that's tolerant of people, strangers, in the broadest sense of the word. So it's a society that wants to be open and indeed small L liberal. What about the politics that derive from that? Now, Brian's covered a lot of the areas, and I'm sure you all understand that over the last 9 years we've had huge amounts of austerity, which has reduced the amount of funding that's gone into public services. Now, it's arguable how that came about. As you said at the start, I was in the Labour Party until 2017, so I can look at it from all sorts of different angles. But let me say why I left the Labour Party and why I joined the Liberal Democrats. I joined the Liberal Democrats and left the Labour Party because of the European Union referendum and my belief that this country is much better in the European Union than out. Now, how we resolve that is a matter that we have to see what the result of this next general election is. There are all sorts of permutations. I think one of the most likely is that if Boris Johnson gets a small majority or works in some sort of coalition, we will come over the next year to find out that actually the only option that he presents is a leave Europe with no deal. And that will be disastrous for us all, for our economy and for our lives. I think that's the most likely thing. But of course the other huge issue that faces us, and particularly you as the younger generation, is the climate change. And I know Andy will tell you a lot about what needs to happen. And of course, I suspect all of us would agree with him that those policies that the Green Party are putting forward are very similar to the policies that all the other parties are putting forward. It's just a matter of whether they can be achieved. I personally think that the policies of the Green Party are a bit too quick, that it's not possible to achieve their goals within that time frame. But it's arguable, and that's where I stand. So how do you decide? You decide on the person, you decide on the philosophy, and you decide on the politics. And that's crucially important that each of you who does vote, either this time or indeed next time, because I think there'll be another election quite soon actually, I think it's really important that you concentrate on those things and talk amongst yourselves. And it's great to have a debate today because that allows you the time to be able to have some space out of your studies to be able to think about where you're going to go with that vote. So, thank you for listening to us, and I hope we have a good discussion.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, there's a myth, isn't there, that all politicians are the same. I mean, you've just heard sincerity and genuine sincerity from two people putting forward some very good ideas. I hope you're going to hear that I'm sincere as well. I started out life as a lecturer in a college like this. I ended up as Deputy Principal at Keighley College, then I ran Hillsborough College in Sheffield, and I became Regional Director of Young People's Learning for the whole of Yorkshire. I've lived locally for 24 years, I'm a Connolly man, and I recently, when I retired, I decided what I'd try and do with my time is I would start campaigning about the environment. And I stood for the Green Party and became the first Green Party district councillor we've got here, and I became a governor of this college. So I've put a lot of effort in because I believe there is one big issue facing us at the moment, and it really should be dominating this election campaign, and that is the multiple environmental crises we face at the moment. The first of those is climate change. You may have seen a couple of weeks ago they announced that we'd reached the highest level ever of carbon dioxide and methane, and it was 47% higher than before the era of industry. 47% higher. That's what we've done to our own atmosphere. If we stopped pumping out CO2 and methane tomorrow, it would carry on getting worse for 20 years. We're not on schedule to achieve that until 2050. So you will be my age by the time we stop making the climate worse. And you've seen the consequences. You may have seen the floods at Hebden Bridge a couple of years back. You may have seen the Boxing Day floods when Tadcaster Bridge was washed away and the bridges near me were nearly washed away. You may have seen recently the floods in Richmondshire or the floods in Don Valley only a couple of weeks back. And of course floods have always happened, but not this intensely, not this frequently, and not this violently. And we have got to get on top of that problem. And the second problem we've got to get on top of is plastic pollution. You will have consumed the equivalent of a credit card in plastic in your food and drink in the last week. That is not the way to have things. You may have seen the Blue Planet programme. Have you seen the Blue Planet with the appalling plastic pollution and the consequences of that? We are on schedule to have 3 times as much plastic in the world in 20 years as there was when the Blue Planet was filmed. Just picture what you saw in that programme happening 3 times frequently. You can't go to a beach now without there being plastic on it. We are covering the entire planet with a thin layer of plastic, and we can stop and control that. And the third problem we've got in terms of environmental crisis is we're destroying species. We're destroying entire rainforests just to get a bit more palm oil more cheaply in a packet of biscuits. That is not, and creatures that go with that. That is not the way for us to behave into the future. And the good news is, we can fix it. We can tackle these problems. We can just do simple things like every house that we build, having solar panels on the roof to generate as much electricity as we use. We can do simple things like stop doing road building and go instead for investing in a decent network of buses across the Dales that we could actually use cheaply. And we could get people off the roads more easily by doing that, because fewer people on the roads if you put them all into larger buses. So problems are fixable, but we need to act locally, we need to act regionally, we need to act nationally, and we need to act internationally. Yet we are turning our backs on the one international organisation that exists in the world that has some kind of democratic control, the EU. We're turning our backs on one of the organisations in the world that has tried to do something about these problems I've just outlined. And we're turning our backs on that for what? For a trade deal with Donald Trump's America that will wreck our sovereignty. Welcome to chlorinated chicken. Welcome to being forced to pay American prices for drugs in the NHS. That's what will happen when US corporate lawyers can sue our government if it doesn't behave with the rules of that trade deal. We are on track to have battery farm cattle imported into the UK, and our farmers in the Dales are going to be devastated if they lose that sheep market. It is 62% of their market in the EU, and get instead trade deals with New Zealand. Picture it, and picture what the Dales will look like after those farmers have to deal with that degree of competition. We can do better. We were promised the easiest deal in history. That's what was going to happen. We've had 3 grinding years of miserable discussion. We are now being promised it'll all be over by Christmas, as we were always promised about the war. It will not all be over by Christmas. It is not possible to negotiate a trade deal with America and negotiate a trade deal with the EU and get them both done. And the EU cannot possibly sign a deal until it knows what we've agreed with America. We're on schedule for years more of grinding, miserable discussions unless we get our priorities reversed, recognise we started out with the best deal we're ever going to get. The EU is messy, makes mistakes, clunky, it needs reform, but it is the best thing we've got to do the job and we need to get international control over an international economy and an international environment. Final thing I'd say is this. I'm going to go back to the bit about we're not all the same. Just visualise what it does to a country when they elect somebody like Donald Trump to become their president. Somebody with his character flaws, who lies so easily and so casually and doesn't even think about what he said. Visualise what it does to the country. And then think about the character of the Prime Minister we've got and ask yourself the question. Man got sacked twice for lying. Man cheated on his second wife while she was being treated for cancer. What would you think of anybody in your personal life who behaved like that? Man advantaged his girlfriend using public office. What would you think of anybody in public office who did that? How can you possibly go out and make that man your Prime Minister? Compare the personal dignity of somebody like Caroline Lucas, or if you like a decent, caring Conservative like Anna Soubry, previous Conservative. Compare the personal dignity of people like that with the behaviour and the lies that have come from the person who's trying to be your Prime Minister for the next 5 years. And then go out and vote with your conscience, vote Green. Thank you.
Well, as you see, I'm not Julian Smith. As you've heard, Julian Smith unfortunately has to be in Northern Ireland. They've got a major NHS pay strike over there, and as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, he continues to do that even though there's an election. He has to be there, and he's sorry not to be here. I have got what he was going to say in his introduction in front of me, so I'll come on to that in a minute. Just to explain who I am again, I'm John Dawson. I'm actually Deputy Chair of the local Conservatives. I was Deputy Leader of Craven Council until May, when I lost my seat, which was just down the road, Skipton North. Before that, before I retired, I was Secretary and General Manager at Skipton Building Society for 13 years. And before that, I taught for 15 years at what was then Leeds Polytechnic. And part of the subjects I taught were European law and international law, and I still voted leave. So anyway, let's see what Julian was going to say to you. The choice at this election is very clear. Under a majority Conservative government, we would deal with Brexit by leaving the EU before the end of January 2020, ending the paralysis and confusion in Parliament, which we've heard about, but actually it's been Parliament that's mucked up everything on the Brexit negotiations for 2.5 years, and that moved the country on. The alternative will be a hung Parliament, bringing more confusion, Mr Corbyn in Downing Street, and a second referendum in Europe, and another year of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. The Prime Minister's new Brexit deal will enable us to take back control of our laws and our money, as well as freeing the UK to do trade deals across the world. And it's the whole of the UK that will be able to do that, including Northern Ireland. Businesses and families need this certainty to plan for the future. But while Brexit is clearly an important issue, in fact it's the reason we've got the election happening really, we also need to think about far more than that, as others have mentioned already this morning. You'll be choosing who you want to represent you for the next 5 years at Westminster when you cast your vote, if you have the vote, on Thursday. A Conservative government will get on with implementing the domestic one nation agenda that people want to see. We're focusing on improving local high streets, bus services, creating more GP appointments, investing money in schools and colleges, and putting more police on the streets. The Conservatives are also focusing on driving the economy forward. We'll invest in infrastructure, technology, and education as the engines that will drive growth in our economy. We as a party recognise that businesses are the drivers of this country's success. Creating jobs, and unemployment is at record low levels under this government. Providing for families and paying taxes, and we want to support business in doing that. With a strong economy, we can fund the strong public services that we need and deliver on our commitments to create more appointments in GP surgeries, spend more on the NHS, raise per pupil funding across the country, and support our armed forces veterans. Julian Smith is passionate about delivering for this area. He's been serving the area as MP since 2010. He's been fighting for the funding for the A59 to be rerouted at Catskill between here and Harrogate, driving forward superfast broadband investment, backing the creation of a shared rural network, fighting to keep Castleberg Hospital at Settle open, fighting to get extra funding for this college, which has been achieved in recent years. He's been fighting tirelessly here and in Westminster. He wants to continue to focus on the needs of our community, in particular our rural community, and the military over at the Ripon side, and young people. He's committed to ensuring this constituency has a strong voice, and that the people here are listened to. There's still a lot more to do, and he needs your support and the support of other electors in Skipton and Ripon to continue this work after Thursday, getting the best possible future for our area. So I hope you'll be able to give Julian Smith and the Conservative Party your support on Thursday. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all. So, questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, James will come round with the microphone. You don't have to use the microphone if you don't want. Don't let that put you off.
My question is for John. Mr. Johnson said that he wanted to bring in 20,000 police officers, but where is he going to put them if most of the police stations have been closed down for budget cuts?
Well, we are going to get those extra police officers. There is plenty of resource within the service for them to be serving. It's vital we get more police on the streets, and we try to reduce the amount of violent crime that we've seen developing in certain parts of the UK.
So I don't know if
Yes, can I?
Yeah.
I mean, actually, of course, 20,000 extra police is not extra police. It doesn't take us up to the numbers there were in the past. And it's one of the extraordinary things that's happening in this election is that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are peddling untruths at a rate of knots. So, for example, when they talk about getting 5,000 more GPs over the course of this Parliament, that's not true. They haven't got any more GPs. More people have gone in, but so many have left because of the conditions they're working under. When we talk about per pupil funding, actually per pupil funding has gone down in 83% of the country over the last 4 years. It beggars belief, actually, how the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson in particular can get away with saying things that are just completely untrue and are proven to be untrue. I just don't have words to describe how appalled I am by it.
Yeah, just a couple of points there. Okay, it's one thing I always found fascinating when it comes to general elections, all these promises suddenly appear. It's like, well, you've been in power for 9 years. Why haven't you done this before? Why are you suddenly now wanting to invest in everything when suddenly you've been taking it all away? And I remember back in the 2017 election, 2015, so many promises were made and nothing's come to fruition, and we find ourselves where we are today. 24,000 police have actually been taken away over the last 10 years. So introduce 20,000, and they won't all be frontline policemen. A lot of them will be back office staff as well. So it won't improve what's happening in our streets. Only Labour can actually do and introduce and build more police stations and bring more police back onto the streets rather than what we're seeing at the moment.
I think all political promises that have numbers attached to them are deeply dodgy, even the ones that come from my own party. I mean, basically, the only thing you can really identify is what your priorities are. But the stuff that's been coming out of Boris in the last few weeks really kind of exceed the norm. There's going to be 20,000 new police. There's going to be 40 hospitals. There's going to be money for FE colleges. There's going to be money for everybody. And as it's been said, where was that money over the last 9 years when the Conservative Party was in power? I am embarrassed as a governor of Craven College that we have not been able to give a pay rise to the staff in real terms for 10 years. Yeah, that is a dreadful position for your teachers to be in. And the funding, there's promised now there's going to be some funding because there's an election coming up. It is derisory on a per head basis. And what more should we be investing in than your future? The state of the country after 10 years of austerity is a shock that indicts us all. I mean, I went to the same food bank Brian went to this week. To have a food bank in Skipton, that is not where we should be. So yes, 20,000 police on the streets rather than in their offices, but will they really arrive, or will it just be forgotten the day after the election?
Okay.
Can I just come back? Everyone keeps mentioning austerity for the last 10 years. Andrew did suggest there might be a cause for that would be argued about. I would argue that the problems that we were left by the previous Labour government in 2010, when one of their own Treasury ministers said there's no money left, we had to take action to improve the economy and the debt, reduce the debt in this country because of the actions of the previous Labour government. Every time a Conservative government comes into power, it has to rescue the country from the economic mess left by the Labour Party.
Can I respond to that?
You can.
Just, okay, that note left in the box was a tongue-in-cheek comment, but if we look at the stats back from then, it wasn't Labour that created the mess, it was an economic crash that created the mess. And also, if you look at what Gordon Brown was doing when he was Prime Minister then, the economy was coming back to a better position. Then suddenly when the Conservatives and the Lib Dems came in a coalition, Conservatives have borrowed more in the last 10 years than any Labour government has combined since they've been in power. So I think it's to blame Labour for everything is wrong, and it's not the way we should be doing politics. We should be looking forward rather than looking back.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
You were cutting the food banks. What are you going to do with the people who need them and relying on them? Because obviously, what are they going to do? Because would they lead to crime, where they get into so desperate they'll have to nick food because they can't rely anymore on food banks? What are you going to do?
Yes. I don't think anybody's... The reason we have food banks is because the welfare state is no longer working for those people. Bear in mind that the majority of people that use food banks are actually working. They are in employment. And although John says employment is at the lowest level it's ever been, of course, that's because many of those people are on 0-hour contracts and as a consequence don't have the rights and privileges that people in full-time employment would have. So, first of all, the people that are using the food banks, the majority of them are in work. That's the first thing to say. That indicates that they're being inadequately paid, and of course the other thing is that the welfare system is not working, and it's not working because of universal credit. It's rather a nice idea actually not to have 6 or 7 different sources of benefit, put it all into one, but the problem with universal credit is it hasn't been financed properly so that it doesn't work. So you have families that something happens, one of the parents breaks an arm or becomes unwell. On a 0-hour contract, they don't have rights to proper sick pay. They start to borrow money. Then things develop. They borrow off their credit card, and then they borrow off the payday lender. By the time they get to the food bank, because many people are quite rightly too proud to go, by the time they get to the food bank, they're in huge amounts of debt. And this is because of universal credit, not as a principle, because it's not, but just because it's not working and it's not effective and it's not efficient. So I think there's various things you can do. We change the economy. We make universal credit work much better, and we've said that the waiting times for universal credit being sorted out will be markedly reduced. And you provide an economy that works for everybody rather than for the very rich.
It is difficult to explain, isn't it, why people in Skipton need to go to food banks. But part of the reason is the cost of accommodation. You can have a perfectly good job in this area, and the cost of rent and the shortage of availability of decent accommodation can mean you're absolutely on your beam end and you need government support. So the first thing I would do is build some more council houses in this area and build for need, not what we're happening at the moment where we're slapping up things that are too large and I think not necessarily appropriate for the needs of the future. The other thing I'd say is I agree with John about sensible, responsible politics. You can't spend money you've not got. And I agree with John that you need a strong economy if you're going to support the poor. But the honest truth is that the responsible fixing the crash politics that the Conservatives started out with have been replaced by the most irresponsible gambling on a no-deal Brexit or a bad deal Brexit. And I really am worried that the party that started out as being about responsibility and decency has lost track of it. The Conservatives used to compete about how many council houses they would build. That is not where they are at the moment. And yes, we have to pay something in our taxes if we're going to be able to help people who are vulnerable. But I think that is the sort of thing a reasonable society can do, instead of seeing people who are working hard, bringing up families, pushing themselves to the limit day after day after day, and still arriving at the food bank for help because they are so desperate.
Yeah, Andrew and Andy have made some really good points there, and it's not going to be fixed overnight. That will never happen. For Labour, we want to reduce food banks by half within a year and then get rid of them afterwards. But there's so many different reasons as to why people go to food banks. Other one is the cost of living is just astronomical at the moment, and we're seeing the gap between who can afford the majority of things and who can't, getting bigger and bigger. The first thing we do is go after companies like Google and Amazon who are not paying their corporation tax, so that money can be put back into public services. Public transport, as you know, at the moment is astronomical. You could buy a ticket, one train ticket, to go try and travel across different areas, and it might not work in one company, it might not work in another, and it costs a hell of a lot. So what we would do is bring back a lot more public transport, nationalise it so it's affordable, and the money is not then, if under private companies, lent out into different countries but kept within our own economy. So people need money in the back of their pocket, so we'll bring a decent wage for people so they can afford to go out and buy things. At the moment we have people in society, and I spoke to a family in Skipton High Street a couple of weeks ago. They were saying they had to wait 5 weeks to get universal credit. They couldn't afford their rent. They were put into temporary accommodation. 3 children not being able to afford to eat. The mum not eating for 2 days so she could provide food for her children. And then thinking about Christmas, she's scared about Christmas. She's going, I can't even go to Poundland and buy a present for our kids. That is absolutely shocking. We've got billionaires sitting around in the nice little comfortable worlds getting more money and more money when the majority of people, the many, are getting less and less money. That is a philosophy that needs to change very quickly.
There's been all sorts of allegations made. The Conservatives actually have done a great deal to improve the economy. As I've mentioned already, the number of people in work, it's 3.6 million people, more people in work than in 2010. There's over 1 million fewer workless households, about 730,000 fewer children living in workless households. The number of people in absolute poverty has fallen by 400,000 since 2010. There are problems with the implementation of the universal credit. The concept, as Andrew's acknowledged, I think, is the right one, to have one simple benefit compared to the range of benefits there were before. The biggest problem appears to be on the delay in bringing in universal credit when people are moving off other benefits. And the government has been working to try and improve that situation. So there's a great deal going on. In the first few months of the government, an increase in the national living wage was announced, which is to equal 2/3 of average earnings. That means over the next 4 years to 2024, there'll be an average pay rise of £4,000 per year for 4 million people who are in need of that support at the bottom end of the wage market. So there's a great deal being going on and continuing to go on in the future if there's elected a Conservative government.
Okay, so can we have another question, please?
So for the benefit of the audience, I'm just going to inform you how Parliament works is there's a pairing system. So government MPs and opposition MPs are paired up, and if one of them can't attend a vote, they usually, the other member of the pair, doesn't attend the vote either to make it more democratic. Julian Smith, as Chief Whip, advised the Tories not to participate in the pairing system. Now, I think that's actually unacceptable. I know obviously you're not Julian. I wish he was here today so that I could ask him how we can trust somebody who would do that.
I have to say, never heard of that. I'm afraid I don't have any knowledge of that to be able to answer it.
So, well, it's a great question, and I wish somebody had asked it when Julian was here, because you are right. He did almost certainly skirt round the pairing system and actually had to have a woman delay her caesarean section to come and vote in Parliament as a later consequence. There's two things I want to say. First is, if Julian was here, he would tell you that he was a staunch Remainer during the referendum campaign and is now a staunch Leaver. Now, I don't understand how in 3 years' time you can change from being somebody who said that the economy in Skipton and Ripon is going to be so much better if we stay in the European Union, that the opportunities for young people such as yourself, if we stay in the European Union, is going to be so much better. How he can now change to a philosophy which says we're going to leave at all costs. Because bear in mind, he's a senior member of a government which is in which the Prime Minister is saying he's going to die in a ditch rather than stay in the European Union. So I just don't understand that level of hypocrisy.
Can I just answer that point? Because obviously, as Deputy Chairman to Julian Smith, I know his views remain at the referendum and mine were to leave, and we had many interesting debates about that. But what he does now is respect the result and respect the vote of the majority of people in that referendum. And for example, in Craven itself, 53% virtually voted to leave against 47% to remain, with a turnout of 81%, which is way above the turnout we get even in general elections. So Julian decided that that was the vote the majority took, and he would respect that, and he's respected it since. He still opposes any idea of no deal.
But that's what you're going to get, of course.
I don't think it is. I think we'll get a good deal.
Doubt it.
Yeah, just this issue of respect. I mean, personally, I've stood against Julian now in 2 elections. I came 3rd last time. And I actually have some considerable personal respect for him. I think as the Conservatives go, he's probably on the best end of the spectrum you're going to find. Compare Julian with somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who they've hidden away for the entire campaign. Those of you who don't know, this is a man who's had 6 children and never changed a nappy, because the nanny does that, but he tells people off for backing the nanny state. That's how out of touch the people were who designed the universal credit system that has caused so much misery both here and across the country. So yeah, I would defend the personal honour of Julian, but there are certain people in the Conservatives I would attack. When it comes to respecting the result, yeah, I do think it's actually important to respect democracy, but I think this. We had a vote on promises that were wild and have proved undeliverable versus threats. And not surprisingly, people said, yeah, I'll have some of that. Yeah, I want 350 million for the NHS. That sounds good. I want sovereignty back. I want the easiest deal ever. Not one of those promises has turned out to be true. So I think we should vote on reality. And if Mr Johnson wants to put a deal before us that divides the United Kingdom with a line down the Northern Irish Sea and defend that to voters and can win it, then we will leave. But I want to see us vote on reality, not wild promises.
Yeah, but some very good points, and I think a lot of people are frustrated with politics over the last couple of years, and I think for young people especially, looking at it going, this doesn't relate to me. I feel quite detached from what happens in the House of Commons, and that's not you know, belittling people's opinions, but it's just people sitting in a room, and it's been a very difficult time in the House of Commons. And again, like Andy says, I do have some respect for Julian. He's had a very difficult job, and in Northern Ireland. But what we need is people that actually say what they're doing, listen to people, and not just think about what they want to achieve for themselves in a career in politics. That's not how it works. When you're elected by a community, you have to represent that community. And going back to the Brexit situation, I voted Remain at the start, and I still would. But as Andy says, there were so many promises made at the start. And the biggest fear for me, and Julian will know it himself as being Northern Ireland Secretary, I spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland, and there is a real concern over there that it's going to go back to where it used to be for decades. And many of you won't have lived through it or seen it, but the Troubles were a really, really horrible place and a horrible time for anyone to be in. And there's a real threat that's going to come back again if we have a no-deal Brexit. Scotland is talking about independence. The UK is going to break up because of this potential no-deal Brexit that is only built upon one thing, and that is for Boris Johnson and his elitist people to get what they want to help line their pockets along with Trump and Farage. That's not what we want. We want something that's going to build our society, protect our society.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anyone else? Any more questions? Come on. Yeah, there's you man here. Let's do you first.
So you've got your personal hatred for Donald Trump aside, like or hate him. Would you not, if a Labour government got into power, would you not have a trade deal with America because they are the richest country in the world?
Yeah, well, we'd be open for discussions, but we wouldn't just rely on America. We'd stick to what we have in Europe as well. And I think, okay, with the trade with America, it is positive and it is a consideration. But I think, okay, putting Trump aside, it is something we'd consider. But it wouldn't be just America that we look to trade with, or China. It'd be all countries. And what's best for the communities, and what's best for workers, and what's best for companies, not what's best for a few.
Could I try that? I mean, I've been extremely critical of Donald Trump and extremely critical of an unequal trade deal with America. What I want is an equal trade deal with America. I mean, international trade's great. You know, it's fantastic for us, makes us richer. But you have to have controls that are equal. If the European Union negotiates a deal with America, it does so as an equal. In fact, it's got bigger population and does so with real strength. United Kingdom, if it's just left the European Union and is in its own and desperate for some kind of trade deal, will have to agree that there is an international arbitration court to decide on what happens between us and America. And that has to exist to be fair when there's disputes. And that means international corporate lawyers telling our Parliament what it can and cannot do if it breaks the agreement that's been signed as unequals. So I am scared stiff of a deal where America wants its farmers to have access to our markets with all their practices, but I'm not scared stiff of an equal deal where we say these are the standards we all agree to hold up to, and these are decent standards, not Donald Trump standards.
Yes, I think international trade is very complex. But basically, once you've had an agreement between one country and another, or one economic group and another, then you have to have some means of being able to arbitrate when there are disputes between those two economic units. In other words, there has to be some system, and that's, of course, where you have, with the WTO, you have a very weak arbitration system. But within Europe, we have the European Union Court of Justice. Now, for the Leavers, and particularly for the right wing of the Conservative Party, they want to have complete separation from the European Union Court of Justice. But actually, if you have international trade agreements, that is just simply impossible. There's another area of the European Union Court of Justice which is very important. They oversee the European Arrest Warrant and Europol. And by leaving the jurisdiction of the European Union Court of Justice, albeit only partially, because if we have a trade deal with the European Union, we'll still be under some of their aegis. If we leave Europe as we stand, we will no longer have access to the European Arrest Warrant or the information we get from Europol. This is a huge risk to our security. There are all sorts of implications of leaving Europe which just haven't been covered by the debate in the press and in the broadcast media, and of course which the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister are only too glad to conceal from us.
John.
I don't think it surprises me that whenever Brexit gets mentioned, it's about being right-wing. Brexit was across party. People who voted Leave were across different parties. It wasn't right-wing or left-wing. It was a different form of argument than the normal right-wing, left-wing we have in this country. What we saw as those who wanted to leave is that we want to trade not just with Europe, we want to continue to trade with Europe, but not just with America, but with the rest of the world. We've always been an outward-looking country to the rest of the world. Europe itself has got its own problems, which again have been very well hidden in the recent past. The southern European countries suffer very severely from being in the euro and not being able to value their currency differently from Germany. And there's still massive unemployment and massive youth unemployment in much of southern Europe. It's not the be-all and end-all, isn't the EU. We need to work with the rest of the world, America being part of that. America is already our biggest individual country trading partner. I know the EU as a group is a bigger trading partner, but as an individual country, we already trade more with the United States than any other country. We just want to build on that going forward.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I'm just curious, judging by the fact that we've got a lot of young people here today, what are the panel's views on lowering the voting age and having 16-year-olds being eligible to vote for the first time?
Can I start with that? I went to a primary school last week and the questions I got asked by the 9-year-olds were pretty impressive. I'm not quite in favour of going that far, but I've actually not detected any difference in the quality of thinking and questions, etc., from a 16-year-old and from an 80-year-old. You know, basically, we should be lowering the voting age to 16, and people make their own decisions. A lot of people I speak to on the street say, I'm not going to vote because I'm not interested in it, I don't know enough. People make that kind of sensible decision, if they're not interested in it. But at 16, an awful lot of people know an awful lot more and have the right to their opinion. And what I will say is this: all the 16-year-olds are going to have to face the environmental problems that my generation is dumping on you. And I rather think we should be listening to you and what you think about the future, rather than us saying, oh, it's okay, I'll still carry on driving my car and filling it up with a gas gun, because I don't really expect to encounter the problems that you will encounter.
I don't think that we should change the voting age from 18. I think it's the right age of maturity for lots of things, and 18 is the right age for voting. Not disagreeing with some of the comments that Andy's made about the intelligence of 16-year-olds, but I just think we need that age of 18, and I am concerned that if Labour get in power or there's a hung parliament, when it comes to a second referendum, Labour have promised they'll reduce the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, but also they've promised they'll give the vote to 2 million EU citizens who live here, not British people, and I think that would be wrong as well.
Okay, just respond to that. So, my wife's from Poland, as I said earlier, so she's lived here for 20 years, she's a paramedic, so as EU national, why should she not be given a choice? As
become a British citizen.
Can I say, there's all sorts of things wrong with our constitution and the way our politics works. I think one of them is actually the voting age is too high. I think if you can serve your country, if you can pay taxes, and we all pay indirect taxes, I think 16 is a fine age. And of course in Scotland, people do have the vote for the Scottish Parliament at the age of 16. But there are all sorts of other problems with our electoral system. At the moment, there are only a very small number of constituencies that ever change hands. This constituency hasn't changed hands since it was incepted in 1984, when it was combined between Skipton and Ripon. It hasn't changed hands in all that time. In fact, very few people's votes actually count. There's been estimates of how many people need to switch their vote to change government. It comes to about 8,000 at some elections. It's very small. What we need is a system where votes matter, and votes should equal the number of seats. So the number of votes that are cast for different parties should equate to the number of seats in Parliament. You then have a multi-party system. That's fine, because what's happened at the moment, and it's mainly over Brexit, of course, is that you've got the Leavers and the Remainers unable to decide. They haven't actually listened to each other. They haven't discussed. They haven't taken on board their other views. If you have a multi-party system, then you have much more discussion. Now, there are systems, there's lots of systems throughout the world that produce parliaments that represent the people much better. And in fact, there are only 2 countries in the world that doesn't have a system of proportional representation to elect their representative house, and that's Canada and the United States. Every other country in the world has a system of proportional representation. We ought to change our voting system, we ought to reduce the age of eligibility, and we should change to a system of proportional representation. The only parties that are against that are the Conservative Party and the Labour Party.
There was a referendum, of course, on that.
Ah, yes, but it was for
the coalition government. The Liberal Democrats asked for the referendum as part of the deal for the coalition. They got it and they lost it.
Yes, but it was... Do you know what the proportion of people that voted in that referendum was?
I don't, actually.
19% of the population voted because it was poorly advertised, and actually it was an extremely poor system of proportional representation that was put forward. It would not have made much difference. It would not have meant seats, votes mean seats, but there are systems that do. We support them. The Greens support them. You don't support them. The Labour Party are swithering.
Well, yeah, just to answer that, I'm in favour of proportional representation, and I think eventually if you get the same amount of people in the Labour Party, they would look at it. But going back to the 16-year-old situation, Andy says it quite clearly. there's a lot of things happening that are going to affect you in the long term going forward. And to think that you don't have the intelligence, 16-year-olds have the intelligence, or 17-year-olds have the intelligence to make a decision about their future is wrong. I think you do have that knowledge and awareness. So that's why we as a party, and for EU nationals as well, as I said earlier, who give a lot to this the society, that's why we wanted to introduce that for the vote.
Okay. Can we have another question? Please, thank you.
This is related to voting age. So 3 of you think that we should lower the voting age to 16, but many of my friends don't understand the fundamental economics needed for a country to work. So 18-year-olds pay tax and they end up understanding like how the economy works. So do you believe that all the people who don't really know what they're voting for should have the right to vote?
Yes, because many people do not understand how the economy works. I think I would have to put myself in that camp. Economics is, you ask 100 economists a question, you get 100 different answers. Like anything, there is all sorts of vagaries. And I can't expect everybody in the population, no matter what their age, to understand how the economy works. Do you know that after the 2017 election, YouGov ran a poll to ask, 3 weeks after the election, to ask a good sample of people who the Prime Minister was. Do you know what the proportion of people that could name the Prime Minister 3 weeks after a general election? It was less than 30%. Okay? Now, it's like this. You might be interested in hockey, for example. You might not be interested in hockey. I'm very keen on all sorts of sports, but I couldn't name you the captain of the England hockey team. Come the Olympics, if the England hockey team get into the semi-final of the Olympic competition, I might watch the highlights. If it was the final, I'd probably know the goal scorer. But 3 weeks later, I would go back to my lack of interest in field hockey, and I wouldn't be able to answer that question. Politics, for most people, is the same as hockey. They only take an interest during the general election because they've got far more important things to deal with in their lives. So I don't think it's fair to expect everybody to understand economics in order to have a vote.
I've spent most of the last 3 weeks talking to people on the streets of all ages, and I have to say that you get some incredibly sophisticated views from ordinary people and you get some incredibly daft views from ordinary people, and I haven't seen any difference in the sophistication level according to age, from 16 up. So I stick by that. On PR, the Green Party at the last election got almost twice as many votes as the DUP, who got 10 MPs and propped up the government. That's what you're in the dilemma. You've heard us all speaking. You're probably sitting there thinking, well, you may agree with John, you may agree with the rest of us. If you agree with the rest of us, you're sitting there thinking, which of the three of them do I go for? I've got to put a cross against one. That is not a decent system. You should be able to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and have the votes transfer across. I mean, I'll argue in this constituency, it's a 20,000 majority, you might as well vote with your conscience. But what I really want is the right for every vote you make to count, and for you to be able to say, I like that person first, I like that person second, and for that vote to transfer if your second person falls out of the contest.
It is a good question, and I think the way I look at it, I've got 2 16-year-olds in my house. I've got Julia, my stepdaughter, and I've got my daughter Alex. Alex is studying politics, and she knows everything she has to about politics. Julia, as soon as I start talking, which is reflective, I think, of most of society. What we need to do is start saying to people and educate and make people aware. Politics is actually about what you do every day. Shouldn't be something that's boring on TV that old men in suits are talking about. It should actually be about, well, how does it affect us every day when we walk out our front door, when we go to school, or we go to work, or we take public transport, we go on holiday, or everything should be about what politics is, and it should be interesting, and everyone should be taking awareness in it. So we all have responsibility sitting here to make it more interesting and make it more realistic for people as well.
Thank you.
No.
Okay. All right, can we have another question? Oh, something up at the back.
I just wanted to go back to something that John said about EU
residents that are currently in the UK, how they really shouldn't be allowed to vote in our general elections. I just wondered why that stance was there, considering they contribute so greatly to our economy.
Thank you.
I just think that a British election is for British people, and I think that the reason why the second referendum next year, if it happened, on the EU membership, it would be basically to slant the vote to make sure Remainers won.
Well, the question is, what's a British person, John? I mean, for goodness sakes.
Well, any of them can become British citizens. They can all become British citizens.
I just can't believe you said that. Extraordinary.
Yeah, just my grandparents were from Ireland, and they told me stories when they first moved over to Scotland. They had windows chucked through their window because of
I'm not suggesting anything like that.
Well,
of course you're not.
You're not, but they had 5 children. My dad was a retired detective inspector. One of my uncles a professor, and he's now a CBE, and the other 2 have done very well in accountancy. So it demonstrates, regardless of what your background is, if you contribute to society, it makes a difference. So to alienate anyone, and that's what I was talking about earlier, divisions in our society is wrong. You cannot alienate people because you don't think they have the right to do anything. Everyone should have the right to, in our society, to do what they want.
Well, firstly, I don't think John is remotely, kind of putting forward racist ideas, but that concept of 2 million people not being able to vote, visualise who they are. I have a friend who has worked 20 years in the NHS as a GP. 20 years she worked. She happens to be Dutch. She's brought up 2 children locally. She has been told she has to apply for settled status to be allowed to stay in this country. 20 years of work for us, bringing up kids in our community, and the reward we give her is say, yeah, you might be allowed to stay here if you fill out this form. Now that's okay for her. She's fit. She's still got all her marbles, etc. There are people here who've served this country well, who are in their 80s and 90s, lying in a sick bed, and their relatives are trying to fill out a form to get them the right to stay with this country. That's what the Brexit ideology has done to this country. We are better than that.
Now I've overcome my initial shock. I think it's just also important to reflect on what the Conservative government did in the last 3 years. They created, deliberately, and they named it, the hostile environment. They created an environment that was hostile to people coming to these shores. These, all sorts, not all from Europe, from all around the world, refugees. This country has been a home for asylum seekers for hundreds of years. We've had waves of migration which have enriched our society. But this Conservative government created deliberately a hostile environment for people coming to this country.
I don't accept that.
The
idea was a hostile environment for illegal immigrants. And settled status is being made a very big issue by people. And in fact, settled status is the way of ensuring that people who are living here can carry on living here in the same way as British citizens elsewhere are going to have to do something as well. There's no application fee, it's a simple form. Nobody will be refused on minor technicalities, and the vast majority of cases already have been granted and will continue to be granted. The only reason people will be refused is if there's some evidence of serious criminality.
Thank you. So, what about one of the 2 girls up at the back, please?
Why do our opinions matter now when I was personally going through my GCSEs, I know people going out protesting against climate change, protesting against everything that you were doing. But I'm at, like, our opinions suddenly matter now. Like, what happened like a year ago when we do have the right, we should have the right to vote. But what are you doing in order to make change now that you realise you've made a mistake? Oh yeah, we need a few more voters, okay.
Can I kick off?
Please do, yeah.
Firstly, thank you for the passion, and it is really good we're beginning to get some female voices in the audience. I tried to stand as a job share candidate with a woman and was told that the rules didn't allow it, and therefore, given her work circumstances, you see me on my own rather than a job share with a woman. We have to get more women with passionate views like yours into politics, and we have to get the thing you saying about this election. suddenly everybody's discovered that they're green. And I think it will last about another, Monday? I think it'll last probably until Friday. The first time a trade union runs up against a policy that interferes with their rights will probably have problems. The first time somebody making money runs up against a climate change policy, I think the Conservatives will ditch it. Yeah, I think basically the commitment is paper thin and the urgency is extreme. We really do need to act and act fast.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and because it's my first time, I think that's why I'm totally passionate about young people, 16-year-olds, having the right to vote. And going back to the climate situation, I was standing with Andy and Andrew in Skipton a couple of weeks ago, which was great, all of us standing together for the same issue. And there's so many young people of all ages, but I heard a family walk past me, an older family, and they're saying, what a waste of time. It's not a waste of time what you're doing. And I would encourage all young people, everyone, that we actually are all green, and that's why Labour's Green Industrial Revolution and New Green Deal is the most radical, and it will work. But yeah, I can't disagree with what you're saying, and I would actively encourage everyone to be the same. Get passionate about politics, get passionate about issues that affect you, and carry it on.
Well, I think you put your finger on a universal truth, that things don't move fast enough. And the younger you are, the slower they seem to move.
I think having been in local government politics along with Andy at Craven, the thing that frustrated me most, having been in a business environment before, was how long everything takes to happen in government or in local government. It's partly because it has to be democratic and you have to consult people and listen to people, hopefully. But I do think it can be frustrating. And on climate change, I accept that we haven't got that long to wait. But the government has been one of the first governments in the world to set a net zero carbon emissions target. Not enough for some of the other parties, but at least it's done it at 2050, which is what the advisors it has for climate change said was the most practical and realistic date to aim for. It's very important that as a country and as local government and as individuals, we all play our part in trying to combat the damage we're doing to our environment.
Okay, thank you. Can we have one more question? We'll go with...
So you said that the economy is getting stronger, but where is all this money going? There's like so many budget cuts and all this.
John, do you want to take that first?
Well, there's lots of evidence it's getting stronger. We've reduced the deficit that the Conservative government inherited in 2010. We've done enough to make people have a national living wage, and started by Labour but carried on by this government. We've done a great deal on getting people out of unemployment and into work. There's a great deal being going on to benefit us all, and I think we will see more benefits of that going forward, especially as an independent country trading with the whole world.
Well, you're right to question it. Of course, the economy is growing a little bit, very slowly at the moment. It's very likely, certainly after we leave the European without a deal, but probably with whatever deal Boris Johnson comes up with, the economy will actually shrink during that time. But the difficulty is, it's the inequality that's in our society and is reflected in our economy, so that we have the extremes of wealth and the extremes of poverty. And that's what us as politicians, and if I'm elected to be a member of Parliament, that's what I think is the most important thing to address. The difficulty is if you take the view of Brian and Andy, they will borrow so much. I mean, Andy's party is planning to borrow £100 billion a year over the next 5 years. That's £500 billion, I believe unnecessarily, and that will ruin the economy. Similarly, Brian's party is planning to borrow sufficient. In fact, the amount that it's saying it's borrowing is not sufficient to pay for the programmes it's introduced. So you have to have a balance. You have to keep the economy stable, but you have to address the inequality. And I think probably all of us here would say that the main thing to do is to address that inequality.
Just going back to Andrew's point about our manifesto and policies and the costing, we've had 163 prominent economists say that what we're putting forward is real and will work. I think the simple question to the simple answer to what you're saying is, let's go to the food banks and let's go to those 4.4 million children living in poverty and all the homeless people and ask them what they think of the strong economy, and we'll see what their answer is. There may be a strong economy, but it's going into the wrong pockets. It's going into the pockets of the billionaires, not into the vast majority of people who deserve it and need it.
Yeah, as it happens, I am an economist and used to teach it, we've had the slowest growing economy in my entire lifetime over the last 10 years. It doesn't strike me as tremendous economic success. Whilst we've inflicted grinding austerity on the poor, £500 billion has been printed and given to the banks in quantitative easing, something the government could have controlled if it chosen to nationalise again the Bank of England. I'll repeat that number, £500 billion of money printed and given away to keep the banks afloat, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that has been done that guarantees us we will not have another banking crisis that will throw all our numbers on all sides out of the equation. The economy is still incredibly unstable because there's no international control of it. The final thing I'd say is two things. Borrowing is a very bad thing to do if it's borrowing to spend wildly. Borrowing to invest is a sensible thing to do. Most of you, probably quite a lot of you, will live in houses where your parents have got a mortgage that they've borrowed against the value of the house. There is nothing wrong with borrowing to invest sensibly. The one bit of our borrowing that I worry about, that the Green Party advocates, is that we're trying to fix the raising of tuition fees to £9,000 a year that happened under, I'll avoid mentioning which government it was that was responsible for that, but I will say it was promised they'd go down to zero and then put up to 9,000, and the cost of fixing that has become almost prohibitively expensive, really difficult to fix, a bad policy choice.
Okay, can we just do our final question? If we do one of these.
You have to choose.
Pick one.
So first of all, I'd like to say, John, you're saying at the age of 16 I can legally have a baby but can't vote. Is that right? Also, obviously Julian isn't here, but as he's the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I'd like to ask how he feels about the revised Brexit deal, which effectively alienates Northern Ireland through the virtual border with the Irish Sea.
Well, I can't speak for Julian, but I can speak for what I think on the Northern Irish border. We've discussed the age issue already. My understanding is that if there is trade going forward from Northern Ireland into the rest of the UK, there will be no change to the present position. The only change will be if we're exporting to Ireland via Northern Ireland, then there will be some checks. Now, to me, the deal that Boris has got actually gives the Northern Ireland businesses the best of all deals, because they're in the whole UK customs union, but they're also getting special treatment because of the links with the rest of Ireland. And so I think that from a business point of view, they will be pleased. And I think that's evidenced in part by the Scottish objecting to that, because they're saying it's favoured treatment for Northern Ireland.
Okay. Let us be crystal clear about what is happening in Northern Ireland. Boris Johnson secured his deal by capitulating on something that Theresa May refused to capitulate on. He went in there and said, I don't mind if EU rules apply in Northern Ireland and we'll put a border up between Northern Ireland and England. He is now denying it because there are votes in denying it, but he's signed up to a deal which insists not just on customs checks between the two. As soon as we get a deal with America or with anybody else, all these wonderful new deals we're going to sign, the customs arrangements will be different in Northern Ireland to what they are in England. When goods move between the two, when there's a border and there's different customs on one side of it and different customs on the other side of it, there is either mass smuggling of everything coming in via Northern Ireland and then into England and then into the whole of the EU, or there is proper checks and taxes on that border. And that's what has to happen as a result of the capitulation deal that Boris Johnson signed us up to save his own skin and dump us with years of mess to sort out.
So, I think it was 2010 when a poll was conducted to find out which are the important issues that mattered to the electorate. And I think the European Union was 10th on the list. So what happened after that was that the Conservative Party, as it had been for many years, was riven by this division as to whether we should stay in Europe or not. Most of us we were living our lives in Europe and quite happy with that, particularly for young people. So we ended up with this referendum purely to serve the Conservative Party. And then, of course, we've followed by 3 years of complete indecision. But the bizarre thing is that it's not just the Conservative Party, it's called the Conservative and Unionist Party. And the Union is the Union of the United Kingdom. In other words, England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. Northern Ireland. They have completely abandoned Northern Ireland because even after another 4 years, and we've settled our deals if we get there with the European Union and America, there will still be a border on the island of Ireland. And there's a huge amount of trade goes across that island, across that border. So that's the border of the European Union with the rest of the world. It will be chaos. And as I think Brian said earlier on, it's a recipe for a huge amount of unrest and going back to the troubles of the 70s and 80s in Northern Ireland. On top of that, we'll also have a referendum in Scotland and almost certainly separation of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom, from England. Imagine the problem that's going to cause on the border across between Cumbria and Northumberland. It just beggars belief. It beggars belief that we have a government that's determined to do so much disruption.
Yeah, just the points have been covered well, but I'm just going back to what I was saying. I spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure Boris Johnson and all these people haven't seen the real fear people have in the communities that we could go back to the Troubles. There are small groups waiting for an excuse to go back to the situation that was there from the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and this could be the excuse. So for any government to put that threat is shocking and disgusting, and we can't let it happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the candidates and wish you all luck on Thursday. Remember to vote if you can, and thank you very much.